Welcome to Braddock's Battlefield History Center. This is the location of a famous battle that took place on July 9th, 1755. Let me show you around so you'll have some appreciation for what happened here. This battle was between the French and the British empires. This is before the American Revolution, before there was a United States, before there were any roads or anything to guide the people by. It is a fascinating story, and some of the famous characters who participated in this battle are on the wall behind me. On the far left is the person who was the King of England at the time of this battle, which is George II. The next image with the gray matting is Charles Lee. Charles Lee fought here under the Braddock expedition. Next to him is Horatio Gates. Gates also led the colonial troops in this battle. What's interesting about Charles Lee and Horatio Gates is that more than 20 years later, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, both Gates and Charles Lee attempted to overthrow Washington as the commander-in-chief of the American Revolution. So although they fought alongside young Washington here, they were obviously more interested in themselves than in what he was trying to do in the American Revolution. The picture to the top is Daniel Boone. At the time of this engagement, Daniel Boone was a very young wagoner. He showed great wisdom. Shortly after the battle began, he unhitched his team of horses and got out of here as quickly as he could. Underneath him is the picture of Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan was also a wagoner who later became the hero of the Battle of the Cowpens in South Carolina. And before that, along with Horatio Gates, he was one of the heroes of the Revolutionary War Battle of Saratoga. This is a picture of Charles Langlade. Langlade had an Ottawa Indian mother and a French father, and he may have been the leader of the Indian troops in this engagement. In a recent study done by the National Historian of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, this was determined to be the second greatest Indian victory in American history. Number one being the victory at the Wabash in Indiana over St. Clair's troops, and number 10 being the defeat of General Custer. So you have some idea of the importance of this from an Indian point of view. It raised in the minds of the colonists the possibility of a victory through use of guerrilla warfare. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, said, "This battle gave us colonists our first indication that we had seriously overestimated the prowess of the British military." So to a large extent, the idea of victory over the British government, which came to fruition more than 20 years later, was born here because here they realized the possibility, particularly if they did not use the traditional forms of warfare used in Europe, but used guerrilla tactics instead. This is an image of George Washington in his French and Indian War uniform. The picture is painted about 17 years after this engagement, so his uniform fits him somewhat snugly, and he is older than he was when he fought here. Washington's engagement in this battle is important. It is also the primary reason why he was selected more than 20 years later to lead the American Revolution. Prior to this engagement, Washington had had three significant failures in his attempt to become a soldier in colonial America. The first was a visit up to Fort Le Boeuf, where he was supposed to tell the French to stop building forts down the Allegheny River. The French rebuffed him at that point, told him what he could do with the paper of Governor Dinwiddie that he delivered. The second was an engagement at Jumonville Glen, which is what we call it now, because at that point Washington allowed his Indians to get out of control and to slay a wounded officer of the French, Count Jumonville, which again was another failure of Washington's. Finally, shortly after that, when Coulon de Villiers led a force out from Fort Duquesne to avenge the death of Jumonville. He defeated Washington at the Battle of Fort Necessity, after which Washington signed a document of capitulation in which he not only surrendered, but admitted to the, quote, assassination, close quote, of Count Jumonville. So at this point, Washington had suffered 3 serious setbacks to his career. And he was about to go back to becoming a farmer in Virginia when he learned that something was going on over in London, that the British were going to take this matter more seriously than previously, and that they were going to send a British general officer, General Braddock, who became the first general officer in North America. This is an image of General Braddock. It is not a portrait. It is painted much after his death by an artist and is part of a separate painting called Braddock and Franklin. But we've brought it here because it's one of the better images of him that's been painted, and we don't have any confidence that there is a first-rate image of Braddock that we can trust. This is an image of Robert Orme. Robert Orme was the aide-de-camp to General Braddock and later became a good friend of George Washington when Washington was added to Braddock's staff simply as a member of the staff and with no rank in the expedition. On the far side is Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage was the leader of the advance guard of the British expedition, and he is the first one to encounter the French and Indians coming out to defend Fort Duquesne at this location. Gage later becomes well known at the Battle of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill in the American Revolution. The French and Indian War, it's important to know that that name was given to the war by the winners, the eventual winners, the British. However, for the first years of this war, the French prevailed, and this battle is one in which the French will prevail again. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through this. This thing called Washington's Frontier Campaigns can be used to understand the things we just recently talked about, which is Washington's unsuccessful visit to Fort Le Boeuf to stop the French from building forts along Fort Michaud and Fort Duquesne down the Allegheny. It also reflects the battle at Fort Necessity here, where Washington lost. This image by John Buxton, which is next to it, is called The Domain of the Three Nations. It's a wonderful painting that shows Washington presenting up at Fort Le Boeuf the letter from Governor Dinwiddie to the French commandant there, St. Pierre. You can see that St. Pierre is studying the document, and he's about to tell Washington and Governor Dinwiddie what they can do with their suggestion that the French stop building the forts down the Allegheny. It's called The Domain of the Three Nations. Washington represents the British Empire, the officers represent the French Empire, and in the doorway we see the Indians who actually controlled this territory at this time. Now, what's important to understand is that at this time we're way before the American Revolution. There is no United States. Secondly, there are no roads in this part of the country. There are only streams and rivers, and anybody trying to find their way up in this area simply has to do that and follow some old Indian trails. But many of those Indian trails might take you to places you really don't want to go. So it's very dangerous to travel up here. One thing that was here was a trading post right where the Monongahela River and the Turtle Creek intersect. A trading post of John Fraser, who was the first resident of the North Braddock area. And he may have been one of the first residents of western Pennsylvania at all. This next map shows the British and French dominions in North America. And what it does depict is the fact that along the Atlantic seaboard, the British, who had far more colonists, were all along the seaboard but had hardly penetrated inland at all, and hardly any of them had gone across the Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains. The French, on the other hand, had come through the St. Lawrence River, And although the British had not made any penetration, the French were all the way beyond the furthest of the Great Lakes. They also had better relationships with the Indians, whom they treated with greater respect and whom they intermarried with. That became important because the Indians and French, their numbers were almost enough to offset the numerical advantage that the British had through their colonists. Next is a very important display. The point we attempt to make here, we discuss the northeastern woodland Indians, of whom we have two representations. The northeastern woodland Indians were led by the Iroquois. The Iroquois were located at the bottom of New York State and the top of the state of Pennsylvania. And they were among the fiercest of all the Indian nations. Among the things that characterized them were mutilation of the ears, including the separation of the outer area of the ear from the rest of the ear, and a lot of piercings and body markings. This is war paint on this one here. This wonderful piece of work next to me is an actual letter from General Braddock to Sir William Johnson. Sir William Johnson was very famous for his relationships with the Indians, particularly with the Iroquois. Braddock met with him on April 15, 1755, in Alexandria, Virginia, before Braddock started his expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. He gave these instructions to Sir William Johnson, which basically gave him the responsibility for keeping the Iroquois neutral and not allying with France, and for providing all Indian support, not only for the Braddock expedition, but for several other British expeditions that were going to be conducted simultaneously. Sir William Johnson is one of the most fascinating characters in history, and we urge you to read more about him. He had a place up near Albany, New York. Very often the Indians considered him one of their own, and he frequently led them in battle. He was highly respected by the Indians. Here we see the actual signature of Edward Braddock. We suspect that the actual handwriting on this may have been done by one of his aides at his instruction or dictation, but the signature is clearly his. This also translates the handwriting that's here. An image of the route of the Braddock expedition, which we used to explain how difficult and long it was. General Braddock arrives with 2 regiments from Ireland in late March. There's a meeting at Alexandria on April 15th. He meets with 5 of the governors at Carlisle House. The governors had been expected to deliver him all the logistical support that he needed for his expedition, but in fact, they delivered nothing because the people who made the planning of this exercise over in London had no idea that it was the general assemblies of the colonies rather than the governors who controlled the purses. So Braddock was furious when he found out that they were bringing him nothing in the way of supplies, nothing in the way of teams, nothing in the way of wagons, all the things that he needed. Braddock was expected to go from Alexandria, Virginia, to capture the forks of the Ohio at Pittsburgh, present-day Pittsburgh, and then he was to go up to capture Fort Niagara. After capturing Fort Niagara, he was to come across the bottom of New York to capture Fort Oswego, and then go up in the Lake Champlain area. So it was an enormously long trek. And yet here he was without any wagons, without any teams, and it became a great crisis. In addition, the planners of the expedition thought that the terrain over which Braddock was going to be traveling would be either flat or gently rolling land. We know that it's the Appalachians and the Allegheny Mountains, which are not only quite steep and challenging, but they are hardwood forests, which meant that if you had to cut down any trees, it was not an easy chore. This is what drove Braddock almost to distraction as he starts out. He does have a friend that he doesn't expect to have. Young Benjamin Franklin at that time is the Postmaster General of the colonies. He meets with Braddock in Frederick, Maryland. This picture depicts that meeting, and it is reflected in Franklin's autobiography. He says that he warned General Braddock about the dangers of Indians and particularly Indian ambushes, but that Braddock says, "Sir, Indian ambushes may be something that you will have to worry about with raw colonial militia, but against the King's regulars they will have no effect." And the artist here, Frederick James, shows Braddock having torn up that message with paper being thrown at his feet. Now, notwithstanding this, Franklin and Braddock got along very well. And in fact, Braddock said of Franklin, "All the others promised me everything and delivered nothing. This man promised nothing and delivered everything." Well, what Franklin did was to arrange to get the wagons and the teams without which Braddock could not have made his expedition. In the center of Pennsylvania and this portion of western Maryland, most of the farms were by German farmers who recently had come over and had begun farming here. What Franklin did was to prepare broadsides or large posters which were widely distributed through this area. And what they said was, "We urge you to assist General Braddock as he attempts to clear the frontier from Indian raids and from French. And please sell your wagons and your teams to him at a reasonable price. However, if you refuse to do so, his quartermaster, John St. Clair, quote, the hussar, will be around to see you." Well, these were the right things to say because the hussars back in Germany had come and confiscated the lands of these same German farmers and their forebears, and so that really brought the fright out. And suddenly all these wagons and teams, and we're talking about more than 100, were made available to the Braddock expedition. And that enabled them to go this distance. Now, they leave Alexandria on April 20th. The battle was fought here at Braddock's Field on July 9th. In between, there's 1 month spent at Fort Cumberland. The reason for that is that Braddock realizes that the Irish regiments that he had been given were far from the cream of the British Army. In addition, the colonial militias he'd been given were even worse. Actually, few of the colonial militia had clothes that matched each other. And they really didn't look much like what he thought his army should look like. So in addition to completing the construction of Fort Cumberland, he drills these Irish regiments and militia until he shapes them up to what he thinks is fighting force. So they leave here about June 10th, and so there's still about a month till they get to Braddock's Field, which is within about 8 miles of Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. This is a tremendous map because it shows all of these things, and most of our guests like to spend time reading it. At this point, we're going to talk about one of the most interesting people of the entire French and Indian War period, who just happens to be the first resident of the North Braddock area and one of the first European settlers in western Pennsylvania. His name is John Fraser. John Fraser was a gunsmith and a trader who originally had a post up near Venango on the French Creek, but when the French started building their forts down the Allegheny River, they threw him out of there and he resettled here where the Turtle Creek enters the Monongahela River. He had a trading post here and did gunsmithing work. He also assisted down at the very first fort that was built at the forks of the Ohio. Fraser was with Washington when Washington was at Fort Necessity at the Jamonville incident. He was also with the Braddock expedition, and he was with the Forbes expedition. So he was all over the place during this period. Washington also stopped at Fraser's place, both on his way up to Fort LaBeouf and back from Fort LaBeouf after Washington had fallen into the freezing Allegheny River. So he's a very omnipresent person. Equally interesting is his wife. His wife was kidnapped while she was staying at their place in Cumberland. And she was taken by the Indians to the middle of Ohio. She was pregnant at the time. She delivers a child in captivity. The child is born alive but dies several months later. Now, the Indians had treated her as well as they treat their own people while she was there. But she is very depressed by the death of her child and decides she is going to escape, knowing that if she does, and if they capture her, she will be not only killed but tortured. Nonetheless, she escapes and gets from the middle of Ohio all the way back to Cumberland, only to find that in the meantime he has remarried, thinking her dead. So there are two views of the story at this point. One says that the first Mrs. Fraser chases the second Mrs. Fraser with a shovel. A more genteel version says that John Fraser says to them, "I will try to take care of both of you, but I will only live with my first wife." He does live with his first wife for the rest of his life. He eventually dies up in Bedford, Pennsylvania. She and John St. Clair administer his estate. He had a place up there called Fraser's Inn, and there is still evidence of that up there. Fraser, in the last years of his life, was a justice of the peace. And the document that you see in the brown frame at the top of it is a writ of execution that he executed there as a justice of the peace in one of the cases he ruled on. It's interesting to note that this thing was about to be thrown out of the Bedford County Courthouse because they thought it was just another old piece of paper. In fact, I was notified of it, and the person agreed to sell it to me. What's particularly unusual is the name of Fraser has always been able to be spelled several ways. There are streets in Braddock, and there are signs like the one here that spell it with a Z. But when John Fraser signed his writ of execution in Bedford years later, he spells his last name F-R-A-S-E-R, which is the first time we've seen how he spelled it. So we've got a lot of signs that are not correct, but we think we get the general idea. The painting in the background is the painting by Robert Griffin called The Winter Trade. It's an example of what a trading post looks like, since most people today would have no idea. That painting shows a lot of activity going on within a winter trading post, and that's probably pretty much what John Fraser's place would have looked like. His trading post was burnt down shortly before the Braddock expedition, but it was a very active place prior to all this happening. This is a woodcut which was blown up from a very small woodcut to a print. It shows the Braddock expedition on its march through western Maryland and western Pennsylvania. Note the mountainous conditions and how the caravan waves its way through the mountains. In the left foreground, you will see some trees that have been cut down. The Braddock expedition had literally hundreds of men out in front of the marching soldiers with axes and saws. It was necessary to create a 12-foot wide road for the wagons and the cannons to pass through. Now, that doesn't mean that they cut 12 feet every time. Sometimes they only needed to cut a foot or two on one side or the other, but they had an awful lot of chopping to do. On the far right of this you can see a corduroy road underneath the marching soldiers. That is why they built that, not for the soldiers, but for the cannons and for the wagons over marshy territory. That's how they would get past. In the case below the woodcut reproduction are pages signed by and written by George Washington. These pages depict his presence in the battle here and the terrible leading the retreat back all the way to near Uniontown after the battle. Washington had been asked by Colonel Humphreys, who was his aide during the Revolution, and Colonel Humphreys was doing a biography of Washington. Humphreys asked Washington to write out his memories of these things, including the French and Indian War and the Battle of Braddock's Defeat. And Washington did that, and this shows his handwriting. We have a book that is also available for sale here that has copies not only of the handwriting, but of typewritten pages which transcribe the handwriting. And they're in Washington's own words as to what happened here and what happened after. We have them on sale at a very special price. These images depict some of the participants in the battle that's to come. We're now approaching western Pennsylvania, and the people are getting ready. On the far left are images of the 48th Regiment of Foot and the 44th Regiment of Foot. These are the two regiments that Braddock has brought after getting them in Ireland and after trying to whip them into some sort of shape. Next to that, in the blue and white, are the officers' uniforms of the French at this time. I would caution, though, that very few of the French involved in this engagement were wearing those uniforms. Many of the French were wearing mountain men or cour de bois clothes, buckskin and the like. And then the next image is that of the northeastern woodland Indians, who also participate in this engagement to a large extent. There you see the Indians. This is a musket engagement. This is not bow and arrow. The Indians are getting ready with their muskets as they leave their wooden homes. The picture is by Robert Griffin. It's called Preparing to Meet the Enemy. The next two images, on the top is a grenadier. Grenadiers wore tall hats to make them appear taller. They always were at the front of the British line of march to intimidate the opposing forces. This grenadier was called that because they threw grenades. It was believed that the taller you were, the further you could throw a grenade. The grenades actually were little more than what we today call Molotov cocktails. The image below that is a British-related Indian spying on Fort Duquesne. He would have been attempting to determine whether the French had reinforced Fort Duquesne because it was taking the Braddock expedition so very long to get there. And Braddock and his officers were worried that by the time they arrived at Fort Duquesne, additional French troops would have come down from Canada to make taking the fort much more difficult. In fact, there was no French reinforcement of Fort Duquesne, but the fortuitous thing was that from the upper Midwest, hundreds of Indians managed to make their way to Fort Duquesne, arriving there about a week before the battle. And the actual numbers of them, there were about 650 Indians, about 100 to 150 French and French Canadians who comprised the force that came out from Fort Duquesne to take on the Braddock expedition. So this really was an Indian engagement. The Indian in this picture, we mentioned the cutting of the ears at the outer level. This person has cut both ears, and he is so worried about someone grabbing them while in hand-to-hand combat that he has tied his ears behind his neck with a ribbon. And this was not uncommon in those days. This map is the only image we have of Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne was eventually blown up at the time of the Forbes expedition's arrival. So there never really was a battle for Fort Duquesne at the fort. The battle for Fort Duquesne occurs here in North Braddock at Braddock's Defeat. The map that's shown here was drawn by Captain Robert Stobo, who had been a prisoner in Fort Duquesne. He had plenty of time, so he made this drawing. He sent it out by a friendly Indian. It reached the Braddock expedition. General Braddock had it with him as he approached the forks of the Ohio. You'll note that the reference is to the Ohio River, which is what the French called the Allegheny. And in fact, you'll see an island in the middle of the Ohio River, which becomes important after the battle, because after the battle, the French take their prisoners, both male and female prisoners, to that island where they torture them by burning them at the stake or by inserting hot metal into them. It's a very violent and savage time. Next, we have some reproductions, in this case, of items from the time. Going from left to right, on the far side is a shiny item called a gorget. A gorget was the last symbolic remaining item of the Knights of Armor's armor back from medieval days. There are also two powder horns in here. Both are inscribed. Of course, the gunpowder was kept there to be put into the muskets. At the top of the case is an Iroquois war club, which was hard wood and very heavy and used for pounding on people's heads. There are two tomahawks. This is a French tomahawk with a very graceful style to it. Underneath it is a standard type of tomahawk. There's also a wampum hairpiece here, which is actually done by an Ottawa Indian woman. Wampum was used as a means of good faith and communication between the Indians. It was only much later that it acquired the secondary meaning of money of some kind. Next, we have the first of Robert Griffing's series about the Braddock expedition. This is called A Warning for General Braddock, and it depicts something that's related in the journals of the Braddock expedition that occurred down near Connellsville, Pennsylvania. It shows the advanced scouts of the Braddock expedition. They come upon a place where there is a warm fire still from the French Indian scouts from Fort Duquesne that had been scouting the Braddock expedition. This is a warning sign from the French Indians to the people following. This is a British Indian looking at that warning sign and understanding it. But lest there be any failure to communicate, the French Indians have also scraped away the bark off of this tree and written on them things like "stay away" or "you will die," other scurrilous type of warnings. It's called A Warning for General Braddock. Over here we see two of the types of Indians that were engaged in this battle. These particular ones would have been northeastern woodland Indians. But most of the Indians who fight in this battle come from the upper Midwest and come from a long distance. This map is very helpful, and it shows the various Native American tribes that come from all these places to the forks of the Ohio. We're talking about Menominee, Winnebago, Ottawa, Chippewa, Wyandot, Mississauga, in addition to Senecas, Potawatomis, Delawares, Mingos. All sorts of tribes are here, but most of them make this trek. Some come by boat across the Great Lakes and then down the Allegheny, but it's believed that most of them come cross-country. And this is such an enormous distance to come, but they arrive about a week before the battle, and they make all the difference in this battle. This is the second of the Griffing paintings of the Braddock expedition. It's called The Crossing. It shows the Braddock expedition wading across the Monongahela River, where the Turtle Creek has entered the Monongahela. It's hard to believe that this happens to anybody who knows the Monongahela River, but at the time of this engagement, There were no locks and dams, so the river was much more shallow. In addition, according to the meteorological records, it was a very hot and dry summer. So in fact, not only was it possible to wade across the Monongahela at these particular crossing points, one near the McKeesport-Duquesne Bridge and this one below Kennywood and over just above where the Turtle Creek enters the Monongahela. But in addition, the troops, as they waded across, were able to play their drums and their fifes. George Washington, in describing this, said it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. The next line, however, says that how beautiful the morning, how tragic the evening. Because once they get across, they're not long before the engagement begins. However, the French had hoped, and the Indians had hoped to come out and get to the Braddock expedition while they were vulnerable in crossing the river. It was very difficult for Bugeaud, who was the young man who led the French out, to persuade the Indians that this was something they wanted to do. Consequently, by the time they finally got here, the British had already completed their crossing of the Monongahela. So this was not an ambush in any way. This is a chance encounter between two forces. Originally, Contrecoeur, the commandant of Fort Duquesne, had planned to blow up the fort and go upriver. It was Bugeaud who convinced them to try to attack the Braddock expedition en route. And Bugeaud had great relations with Native Americans, and he thought he could persuade them to come out and prevail in this engagement. In fact, he had to spend most of the night before the battle and much of the morning trying to persuade them. And finally, through cajoling and intimidating and challenging their manhood, he finally got them to come out. These Native Americans were not inclined to fight on the basis of honor or loyalty or glory. They needed two conditions to be fulfilled. One was they had to believe that it was likely that they would win. The second was that if they did win, that there would be plunder for them to take back to their homes. Their concern with this was whether they could win. They had been hearing for long periods of time about the strength of the Braddock expedition and how big it was and how powerful it was. So they had concern on that point as to whether they were going to prevail. They knew that if they did prevail, given the size of the Braddock expedition, there would be plenty of plunder for them to take back. But this is what Bugeaud had to overcome. Bugeaud was stripped to the waist, wearing a gorget, waving a sword, and he leads them out from Fort Duquesne, and they make their way out here, which, given the number of Indians and all the different tribes they were with and all the different leaders and things, must have been like herding cats. But somehow Bugeaud gets them out here, and just about at the point where we are now, this is where the two forces first bump into each other. And the great tragedy is that when they engage each other right here, with one of the very first volleys, Bugeaud is shot and killed. So there's confusion on the French and Indian side at that point. There are different claims as to what happens and who is responsible for that happening, which we'll go into in a few moments. Also on these tables are 5 different cases showing genuine artifacts from the period. Almost everything that lasts for more than 250 years is either iron, metal, or glass. Few other materials last that long. These cases are interesting because they are primarily the work of blacksmiths, so one begins to get a feeling for how important a blacksmith was at this time. On the far left, we have some very delicate pieces of blacksmithing work, and they move to the more coarse kind, including shovels and hoes, as you move down through the various cases. This is an impressive collection done by 3 gentlemen over a period of 20 years with metal detectors. They found all these things along Braddock's Road. We are very grateful to them for allowing them to be here. One item of particular interest are these musket balls that are in this case. Two of them have teeth marks in the bottom of them. That's because at this time, if you were shot in the arm or in the leg, in almost every case it resulted in an amputation. Medical treatment was very crude. Added to that was the fact that there was no anesthesia that was available for this amputation. So one of the things that was done was to give you a lead musket ball, tell you to put it in your back teeth, and, quote, bite the bullet, which is where that phrase comes from. Next, we have some helpful maps to help us understand what happened here. After this battle, the colonies and Europe were astonished. Nobody could believe that a small number of French could have defeated the mighty Braddock expedition. Even less did they believe that what they regarded as savages could have defeated the Braddock expedition. Jeffrey Amherst, who became the commanding general of the colonial forces after Braddock's defeat, wrote to McKellar, who was the chief engineer of the Braddock expedition and who was in the battle, asking him to explain what in God's name had happened here. These two maps were sent by McKellar to Jeffrey Amherst to explain. The top one shows at the far left the force of French and Indians coming out from Fort Duquesne. They encounter the advanced elements of the Braddock expedition. The Braddock expedition has completed its crossing of the river, but some of the elements are still pretty far back. The bottom shows what happens during the battle. The Indians go down both sides of the Braddock expedition. The French apparently stayed pretty much in place where they first encountered the Braddock expedition and far from there. On the other hand, the people who were at the rear of the Braddock expedition moved forward, causing congestion and confusion. The people who were at the very front ranks pulled backward. This is Gage and his advance guard. You end up with a great concentration called the telescoping of the column, or a great red target of red uniforms that is right in the middle and very confused. So that's what McKellar explains is what happened. It's the best possible information we have. Some years later, in 1909, two engineers working at the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, being fascinated with the battle, decide to overlay McKellar's drawings on the street grids of Braddock and North Braddock. And these next two images reflect that. And it shows where this appears to have happened, what happens where. Here in blue are the French coming out. Here's the advance guard that engages them right about where we are. Here are the rest of the Braddock expedition strung out down here. The second one shows what happens during the battle. The blue indicates the Indians all around the Braddock expedition, the great massing of the British up in the center, and the slaughter that then ensues. This battle goes on for 3 hours. Among other things, if you fire a musket, it makes a lot of smoke. If you fire thousands of muskets for 3 hours, there was probably so much smoke that people couldn't tell what they were shooting at. But most people find these images very helpful in understanding what happened here. The next image is by Francis Deming, and it is, many people really like it as helping them understand what happened. The original painting is in the State Historical Society of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. It shows General Braddock being shot in the right side and falling from his horse. And that, in fact, is what happened. Braddock dies from that wound 3 days later down in the vicinity of Uniontown. You see General Washington, who was his aide, reaching to grab the reins of Braddock's horse. In the smoke, you see the grenadiers lined up, standing up, firing out. You see some wagons from the Braddock expedition. In the foreground, you see the French and the Indians firing from cover and from grass and bushes and stones and other things. They go all the way around here. The gentleman in the left with his hand raised is Charles Langlade. Charles Langlade may have been the person who really led the Indians in this engagement. He was a leader of Indians in battles both before this engagement and later up around Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. It was generally said by the Indians that it was he who really defeated Braddock and not Dumas. Now Dumas, who was the second in command of Bugeaud, wrote the only French first-person account of the battle. He claimed that he kept his head while everybody else was losing theirs, and that he, in fact, becomes known in Europe as the hero of the Monongahela. Whether it was Dumas or whether it was Langlade, we really don't know. It's also possible that the Indians just did what they always did in this engagement, which was go down both sides of the opposing force. So maybe nobody really led the Indians, but it's clear that it was the Indian tactics that caused this victory for the French and the Indians. Here you see a great cloud in this picture. I mentioned that if you fired 1,000 muskets for 3 hours, you probably had such a cloud that you couldn't see a thing that you were firing at. I suspect that was the case. The next image is another image of Braddock's defeat. It's by Emmanuel Lutze. Emmanuel Lutze was also famous for painting Washington crossing the Delaware, although he regarded this painting as his masterpiece. This is a photograph of the original because the original is 8 to 10 times this big. And we could not fit that into this location. It is presently on the second floor of the Braddock Carnegie Library. I was able to recover both this painting and the Franklin and Braddock image that we saw earlier from a place where they had been inappropriately taken. This shows Washington firing a cannon, and indeed there was a cannon brought into play in this engagement by the British and the colonials, but it didn't make any difference because they couldn't see what they were firing at. It's believed that up in this area is the rising ground to the right, where the French and the Indians, and mostly the Indians, were. Here on the lower left, you see the massing of the British troops. Over here, you see the Virginia militia attempting to go up and dislodge the Indians from the rising ground. Unfortunately, in great confusion of warfare, the British massing here fired on the Virginia militia and killed almost every one of them. So there was nothing but confusion in this entire engagement. But this is Emmanuel Lutze's painting of Braddock's defeat. Next, we have two other images. Most of these paintings were done about 1850 or about 100 years after the battle. For some reason, a lot of artists decide to commemorate the centennial by trying to imagine what it looked like. Remember that there were no photographs that anybody had to rely on. The historical sources were somewhat limited, but everybody knew about Braddock's defeat. It was the biggest thing that had happened in the colonial period. So much so, by the way, that 40 years after the battle, when the Whiskey Rebellion is occurring in western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion occurs mostly in the south of Pittsburgh and some distance from here. But they decided to have the largest mass meeting of the Whiskey Rebels. And the only place that everybody in western Pennsylvania knew was Braddock's Field. So 6,000 people meet on Braddock's Field in the largest mass meeting of the Whiskey Rebels. And that was something that, paradoxically, George Washington, then president, had to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. But what happens here was very famous and was a big thing in the colonies. This is an image from the National Archives of Canada. It's called The Fall of Braddock. It's a very nice, dark, black and white image, and it's that artist's idea of what occurred here. The next image is by Bruno Stearns. It's one of 4 images that he made of Washington. This is the first, called Washington the Warrior, the Monongahela. And it attempts to depict Washington on a white horse taking charge after Braddock has been wounded. Some unusual aspects of this painting show Braddock apparently falling into the arms of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant, which doesn't seem to work historically. It also shows Washington's horse giving a not so gentle nudge to General Braddock, and it shows a horse in the center attempting to climb a tree. This painting, which appears on the front of many books about the battle and about the French and Indian War, and is also on the front of the Heinz History Center, is not one of my favorites. Next image is by Howard Pyle. He was a terrific artist. He does his work mostly in pen and ink. His work appeared in Scribner's magazine in the late 1890s. This is a blow-up of one of the pages in Scribner's magazine. It shows the British militia who are always all packed together. The next image shows Howard Pyle's depiction of British grenadiers bunched together and being fired upon. Howard Pyle was a famous American artist who does his work mostly in pen and ink and who greatly influenced a lot of the American artists in the early 1900s. It's a wonderful drawing. We have one other drawing by Howard Pyle. Both of these appeared in Scribner's magazine in 1893. The other drawing shows General Braddock being placed in a cart after his wounding. In the center, we have the image by Robert Griffin, wonderful painting called The Wounding of General Braddock. It shows Braddock being placed at the base of a tree, holding his right side where the bullet entered. Young Washington has his hand on Braddock's shoulder. Thomas Gage is shown in front of Braddock, obviously asking some kinds of questions. To the right are several other minor characters during the period whom the artist identifies in an accompanying signage. To the left of the painting, you'll see someone turning around a covered wagon to put the general in for the trip back to the Uniontown area. You also see some people headed to the rear. This occurs late in this 3-hour battle. They have been being defeated, and now they hear that the general has been wounded. Consequently, you see people who look to be running to the rear. These people are headed to the rear. So this is a pretty bad time in the engagement. It's a wonderful painting. It also shows the woods-like character of what this area would have been at that time. This case shows items found in the vicinity of Fort Necessity along Braddock's Road. It shows 2 small cannonball type items that were fired from a pivot gun. It shows a fragment of a cannonball, a horn penknife, a fascine knife for cutting fascines, which were used to make bundles of sticks for people to fire from behind, and it shows a bayonet. The center case displays a book written by Dumas, who was the person responsible for the only French first-person account of the battle. However, the book is written after the battle, and it talks about his advice to the future King of France, and he's telling him how to deal with the North American colonies. It's in Dumas' handwriting. It's the original. There are two copies of this. One of them is in the Clement Library, the University of Michigan. But this is the original. We also have the translation since it's in French. In the case on the far right, these are the only artifacts that we're sure came from the battlefield. Again, most of what's last for this long is either metal or glass. These are all metal items. Many of them are parts of muskets. Two unusual ones are a spontoon blade, and this is a spontoon. This is a reproduction of a spontoon. It was used initially by infantrymen to ward off charging cavalry horses, but by the time of this battle, it was simply used by non-commissioned officers held above the smoke of the battle to give directions as to where the troops should go. The most unusual item in this case is a medal of a Russian empress, Empress Anna Ivanova. It was found in a wooden box buried in a shallow way on the battlefield. Also in that box were rings and coins. The medal was offered to me along with the other things, but I only purchased the medal because it was already outrageously priced. There's a great question of what's a Russian medal doing on an engagement between the French and the British. Although the dates are correct, the medal is dated before this battle. We know that the French and the British had been fighting on and off for many years before this engagement over in Europe. We also know that there were switching alliances over there, so that the Russians and the Prussians and the Austro-Hungarians were switching sides all the time. So it would not be unusual to find one of these participants having a Russian medal. But still, what's it doing in this box? Since there was this medal, there were coins, and there were rings, one item of speculation is that it's possible that this chest or box belonged to the surgical group of the Braddock expedition. On the edge of this medal is carved either an N or a Z, depending on how you looked at it. If it was an N, the Surgeon General of the Braddock expedition was named Napier. What would the rings be doing in the box? Well, if you did enough arm amputations, you might end up with a number of rings. What were the coins doing in the box? Well, if people died on the table, you might take the coins out of their pockets before you buried them and threw them all in the box. And once the battle was joined here, and it seemed to be going badly, they didn't want to carry this box all the way back while they were running for their lives, so they buried it in a shallow. That's one theory of what might have happened. We have no idea why it's here. This coin has been examined by many historians and coin experts. It's been looked at up in Canada, and nobody can quite explain what it's doing here. This is the image by Howard Pyle of General Braddock being placed in a wagon and taken back to the area near Uniontown. In this case, it's a covered wagon, which is what Griffing has depicted in the earlier painting. On the other hand, this is another artist who has Braddock in a wagon that doesn't have a covering on it. We know that he was bounced all the way from here down to near Uniontown, near Fort Necessity, where he finally died. This painting with the purplish matting shows Braddock's grave, shows young Washington praying over him. We know that he was buried in the middle of the road, that they drove horses and wagons over the grave so that the Indians would not know that it was a grave and desecrate it. We know that that grave stayed pretty much undisturbed for approximately the next 50 years, even though the road became the Braddock Road, which was a major way to get from the east to the west. We do know also that in about 1805, about 50 years after the battle, that for some reason the body was disturbed. It was moved from that location about 100 yards away to where it is presently entombed in a stone monument with an iron fence around it. This is the third of Griffing's Braddock series. It's called The Triumphant Return to Fort Duquesne. It shows the fort with small puffs of smoke as if the cannons are welcoming these triumphant warriors. The warriors are yelling what they call the scalp halloo, which was their victory cry. On the far right, you see a pack horse loaded with the plunder that was the reason why the Indians came to engage in this battle. You see an Indian with a British battle coat. You see other Indians with bedrolls and canteens. Down here you see a European who has tar or pitch on his shoulders and head, which meant that he was to be taken as a prisoner to that island off of Fort Duquesne, where he was to be tortured and killed. If you were lucky in those days, you were killed during battle. There was nothing worse than becoming a prisoner on either side, for that matter. What is interesting from the artistic point of view, some people suspect that this is done from the standpoint of the civic arena. Others speculate that it's a little further over near Duquesne University. Wherever it is, you cannot see the point because of all the tall buildings that are in the middle ground. So the artist has had to imagine a middle ground here, and he's done a marvelous job doing it. Again, by the time they're returning to Fort Duquesne, the sun is going down, evening is approaching. It's another one of those wonderful things that Griffing has done to help us get an idea of what was happening at this period. This is the fourth or the last of Griffing's original Braddock series. This depicts something that happens 3 years after the battle. We know that the Forbes expedition comes across Pennsylvania instead of up through Virginia and Maryland. And it comes across Pennsylvania and eventually appears and captures the forks of the Ohio. We know that the French blow up the fort and go upriver before Forbes enters onto the fort. The British then decide to send out a burial detail out to Braddock's Field out of respect for the people who died here 3 years before. Now, the second in command to General Braddock during the original battle was Colonel Halkett. During the battle, Colonel Halkett was shot and killed. He had a son, another Halkett, who ran to his side, and while he was looking down upon his father, that Halkett was also killed, right on top of his father. When the burial detail was sent out by the Forbes expedition later, there was still a third member of the Halkett family that was with the Forbes expedition. And he asks if he can come out with the burial detail in hopes that he could see the remains of his father, whom he thought he could identify because of some unusual dental work. There were 2 Indians who claimed to have been with the Braddock expedition and to have seen Halkett's father be shot and his brother run and also be shot. These are the 2 Indians. These are the 2 skulls that they find. All that the Indians could remember was that this happened near a remarkable tree, and this is the artist's idea of a remarkable tree. This is young Halkett, who's now looking at them and has recognized his father's unique dental work. And the accounts vary, but he either got sick or fainted when he saw and recognized his father and his brother. The artist calls this the reunion. It's a very touching thing and ties together the Braddock and Forbes expeditions and the final thing that happens to Fort Duquesne. We also have a mock-up of a musket, a drawing of musket pieces, another map, and that is the end of the tour, although this is the point at which we also show videos. We have 8 different French and Indian War period videos, which we strongly recommend. This is our video room, and it's normally the end of the tour. We have here about 10 videos of the French and Indian War period. They run from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. And most of our guests stay for the entire video after making the tour of the museum and the History Center. We have over here a very large image by Gus Higgins, another attempt to depict Braddock's defeat. We also have in here a plaque which speaks of General Edward Braddock. That has been redone. It was originally silver with blue lettering, but it had been defaced by spray paint. We had it redone so that it tells its story again. This is a very comfortable room, and most of our visitors stay here and enjoy it, and we hope you will too. We thank you for coming.